Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Ashrafil Anbiya wal Mursaleen Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Amma ba'd. Fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. The book which I have in front of me is the Mukhtasar of Imam Quduuri Rahimullah. And this particular book is a book based on Hanafi jurisprudence, based on the Hanafi interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so far from this particular book, in another venue we have touched on Tahara, purification, we have touched on namaz, we have touched on zakat and fasting, and we've also touched on buyu, business and financial transactions. We also touched on riba and interest. And in this venue we have touched on gifts, we have touched on luqata, lost and missing objects, and in last week's lesson we touched on waqf properties, we touched on items which are perished or destroyed, and also the art of borrowing in Islam. Now the next topic which we are going to look at from this book of Mukhtasar al-Quduuri of Imam Quduuri Rahimullah is the topic of nikah and marriage in Islam. Now nikah and marriage is something which is very important. It's important because number one, it's the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and number two, it is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Quran has used the words libas to describe marriage. Allah says, Hunna libasul lakum wa antum libasul lahun. That hunna, i.e. these women, they are libas for you, and they, i.e. the men, are libas for you, i.e. the women. Now what does libas mean? Now libas literally means clothing. So like jumper, some kameez, kurta and so on, they are called libas. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's describing the marriage and He's saying that the relationship between a husband and wife is like that of a piece of garment, is like that of a kurta, is like that of a kameez. Now scholars have debated long and hard that why has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the word libas to describe marriage? There's many other words I'm sure Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have used to describe a marriage contract and the relationship between the husband and wife. Now the scholars have written, like Imam Qurtubi Rahimullah, he has written that when we analyze one's kameez or one's clothing or one's attire, we can find that it serves two benefits or two purposes. The first benefit of one's clothing is that it protects a person from the cold, it protects a person from the heat. And when we analyze the nikah and the marriage, it protects a person from sins. That's one of the, as we're going to look at later, not getting married, you're prone to do two things. Number one is looking at unlawful women, and number two, committing zina and adultery and fornication. We look at this hadith from Bukhari and Sahih Muslim later. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's saying that when somebody gets married, then he's protecting himself from badnazri, from looking at unlawful women, and more importantly, he's saving himself, protecting himself from zina, from adultery and from fornication. And number two, the second benefit of clothing and attires is that when you wear loose and comfortable clothing, you feel at peace, you feel content with yourself. If you're wearing like tight clothing, you don't really feel that comfortable. In particular, if you've got a lot of flab and so on, you don't really feel that comfortable. But if you're wearing loose and comfortable clothing, you feel at peace with yourself, you feel like content with yourself. So similarly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that the best way of achieving peace and tranquility in your life is through marriage and is through nikah. Those who are single, they try to do various things to fill in the hole, the emptiness in their life. Sometimes they go out with their mates. They'll go to a takeaway, they'll spend some time with them, 2-3 hours. So during those 2-3 hours, okay, they're happy, they feel good with each other, they feel nice and so on. But as soon as the meal finishes and they come home, they're then empty again. There's not that peace and tranquility in their life. Sometimes they probably put on a movie, they'll watch a film. If the football's on, they'll put the football on, they'll watch football, they'll watch a movie. But as soon as the football finishes, as soon as the movie finishes, then that's it. The emptiness comes back again. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that the best way to achieve peace and tranquility in one's life is through nikah and is through marriage. Because there's another hadith with regards to people who remain single, in a hadith which can be found in Musnad Abu Ya'la and Tabrani, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that the worst amongst you are the bachelors, i.e. those who are single and so on. Okay? So those who are single, those who are bachelors, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that they are the worst of people. Now worst doesn't mean like generally there's like bad people or evil people. They would become worse people if they then sacrifice, they don't do the nikah and the marriage, and then they start committing sins. Then they become the worst people. Obviously if they are not, for some reason they can't get married and so on, or they're not in sins, then obviously they're not the worst people. But obviously those who are single and they are committing sins, they are committing bad things, they are doing adultery and fornications, they are looking at unlawful women, then fair enough, the hadith does say that these people are the worst people. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mention a few hadiths regarding the importance of nikah and marriage, and also I'll mention 1 or 2 hadiths regarding the virtues of a pious woman and what that does to a person's iman and faith, before we look at the rulings with regards to nikah and with regards to marriage. Now the first hadith which I'm going to mention is a hadith which can be found in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said, "Man istata'a minkum al-ba'a," which means that those who are capable of getting married, ba'a meaning those who have the means to get married, those who have the means to do the nikah and the marriage, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said, "Falyatazawwaj," they should get married. Then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam explains the benefit of getting married. فَإِنَّهُ أَغَضُّ لِلْبَصَرِ, that by getting married you lower your gazes. فَإِنَّهُ أَغَضُّ لِلْبَصَرِ. Now you may be thinking that lowering your gazes, looking at unlawful woman, what's the big deal and so on. Now I'll tell you why is it so important to lower your gaze. There is a hadith which can be found in Majma'u Zawaid that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that the eyes, they commit zina, they commit adultery. And then similarly the hands, they commit adultery. The feet, in terms of when you go to the woman, that also commits adultery and fornication. And then afterwards, if you then do the actual act, then you'll get the grave sin. But similarly, looking at unlawful women, you get the sin of committing adultery, but the zina of the eyes. So, and another point, that's one point. Number 2 is that looking at unlawful women, it takes away the halawat and the sweetness of one's iman. Remember, Imam Ghazali rahimahullah has mentioned that we have what we call, what is known as the 4 poisons of the heart. And one of the poisons of the heart is unlawful women. Meaning, just think of your eyes and your senses to be a kind of a pipe to your heart. Remember, the main thing is your heart, isn't it? Like you need to make sure that there's no kind of like razils and any kind of vile characteristics in the heart. You have to make sure that your heart is purified and so on. Now we got all these senses. Now if we listen to someone backbiting, it goes down our ears, it goes into our hearts, and it affects our heart. If we eat haram, or we talk haram, we backbite about someone, we slander about someone, then our tongue is also a pipeline to our heart as well. Similarly, our eyes is also a pipeline to our heart. In terms of if we use the eyes for good things, but in terms of reading the Quran, in terms of doing good things, like looking at good things, good books and so on and so forth, then I'll mention a point. Imam Shafi rahimullah, he said that when somebody looks with his eyes at good things, his eyesight becomes better. And someone who looks at, say for example, bad things, then his eyesight becomes weak. Now it doesn't mean that those who got glasses, they got bad eyesight, they're looking at unlawful women. No, what I mean is that, like generally speaking, that's like a point which Imam Shafi rahimullah has mentioned. Obviously, that's not the only reason. There could be other reasons why someone's got bad eyesight. But one of the reasons is that somebody looks at good things, his eyesight tends to be strong and powerful. Those who look at bad things, then their eyesight become weak. That's why it's mentioned in one of the books of Hanafi jurisprudence, Fatah Hindiya. It's mentioned that even if someone's a hafiz of a Quran, it's more recommended that he reads the Quran by looking. So even when he's doing his door, even though you're reading from memory, even then it's best just to have the Quran open and just look at it. Even though you're not actually concentrating on the harakat and the Arabs, but just have it open and look at it and read it. Why? Because the Holy Quran, when you look at it, it kind of makes your eyesight more better and more powerful. So as I was saying that, the opposite of that, obviously looking at unlawful women, looking at bad women. So as I was saying that it's like a pipeline to the heart. So when somebody looks at an unlawful woman, then do you know all the ibadat you've done, you've kind of like wasted it. Okay, you've wasted all the ibadat, you wasted all the worship. Just for example, you were praying Maghrib, you were praying Isha, then afterwards you leave the car park and then you see an unlawful woman and you look at her. If you just looked at her but accidentally, and then you take your nazar and your sight away, that's okay. But if you keep on looking at her, get binoculars out and start looking at her and so on, then that will obviously be unlawful and haram, okay? So the first thing of marriage and nikah is فَلْيَتَزَوَّجْ فَإِنَّهُ أَغَدُّ لِلْبَصَرِ. So أَغَدُّ لِلْبَصَرِ, it lowers your gaze. And remember, lowering your gaze is actually a Quranic verse as well. I'm not looking, even though what I mentioned was from Imam Ghazali rahimullah, and I was looking at it more from a spiritual point of view. But at the end of the day, even if you don't want to look at the spiritual side, it's an order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَكُلِّ الْمُؤْمِنِ يَغُضُّ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ وَكُلِّ الْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَغْضُضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِنَّ. It's an order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Believing men, they should lower their gazes. And similarly, believing women should also lower their gazes as well. Now the next benefit of getting married and nikah, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said, وَأَحْسَنُ لِلْفَرَجِ, that through nikah and through marriage, it protects one's private parts, i.e. protects a person's modesty. Because someone who's not married, someone who's single, he's prone to either commit zina or adultery, or something which is very, very common nowadays with Muslim youth, masturbation and so on. We look at this, probably touch on it some other time, but this is something which is very, very common in Muslim youth, masturbation, fulfilling their desires in a way which is not lawful against the Sharia, even against nature. That's why many of these things which we hear of incest, like men committing like adultery with their own siblings, like with their sister, abusing their sister, their mother even, and so on. It happens when people who are not married and then they watch movies, they're on the internet for hours and hours and watching wrong and filthy things. That's what happens. The desires overtake them to such an extent that na'udhu they commit adultery with their own sister, they commit adultery with their own mother. Even if they're not committing adultery with their mother or sister, they touch them in places where they're not supposed to be touching them and so on. So this unfortunately happens not through marriage. Like if you're not getting married, this is what happens. So this is what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying, وَأَحْسَنُ لِلْفَرَجِ, Okay, that it protects your private parts, it protects modesty. And then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam goes on to say, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَعَلَيْهِ بِالصَّوْمِ فَإِنَّهُ لَهُ وِجَاءٌ. That if somebody cannot get married, then what he should do is that he should then fast. Because when you fast, it suppresses, because there's two things in our heart. One is lust and desires, and number two is anger. Now, there's other ways of suppressing anger, which we're not going to look at, but one way of suppressing lust and desire is through fasting, because when you're fasting and so on, then it takes away the craving of women, it takes away lust and desires. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying that those people who are unable to get married, فَعَلَيْهِ بِالصَّوْمِ, they should fast. There's another hadith which comes up afterwards. I'll just mention the theme of the hadith, or the hadith in a nutshell. That Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that the gravest or the greatest test or the greatest fitna, or the fitna which is the most severe for this ummah, is the fitna of women. Many tests which a person will have. Remember, this dunya is full of tests. You get tested in various ways. And even, say for example, if somebody, alhamdulillah, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected him from various types of illnesses, various types of, this and that, poverty and so on, even then when he goes through old age, he will be tested by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there are many fitnas, many tests Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put for the Muslims and for the ummah of Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But as mentioned this hadith of Sahih Muslim, and Sahih al-Bukhari, that the gravest fitna is ad-darra ala rijal minan nisa, is the fitna of women. And in another hadith of Sahih Muslim, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam points out that the first fitna which led to the destruction of Banu Israel, i.e. Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam people, was the fitna of women. It's mentioned, is a very famous story which I'm sure some of you may have heard of before, that Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam and the Banu Israel, there was a person from the Banu Israel whose name was Bal'am bin Ba'ur. Now Bal'am bin Ba'ur, he was one of those people who in Arabic we call mustajabu da'wat, i.e. very pious, that if he was to make a dua or a supplication, Allah would accept his dua, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would accept his supplication. So what happened was that from his tribe, who were the Banu Kan'an, they came to Bal'am and they said to him that, make a curse, because your duas are accepted, make a curse against Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, make a curse against the Banu Israel. So Bal'am said that, look, he's a prophet of Allah, how can I make a curse against a prophet and a messenger of Allah? So he then said to them that, you know what, I'll do istikhara and I'll let you know tomorrow. So Bal'am, he did istikhara, and in his istikhara he saw a dream, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling him, or the message came in the dream, that not to curse Musa alayhi salam or his people. Why? Because Musa alayhi salam is a messenger and he's a prophet of Allah. Now the next day he then told his people that, look, I'm not going to be cursing Musa alayhi salam. I did istikhara and this is what I saw in my dream. But they kept on pleading and said, please, curse Musa alayhi salam and so on. So eventually what happened was that his people, they bought him out, they gave him, tempted him with money, wealth and so on. So his intention was to then climb one of the hills and make a curse against Musa alayhi salam. In those days what they would do is that whenever they would make dua or supplication, they would climb a high place, because they think that the more higher they are, the more closer they are to Allah. Okay, the seven heavens. Obviously you're still billions of miles away from Allah, but they would think more closer to Allah. So he went to climb this hill. So he was on his donkey, and it's mentioned in the shuruhats, in the commentary of the hadith, that even his donkey was speaking to him. He was telling him that, don't curse Musa alayhi salam. But he didn't listen to the donkey. He then climbed the hill. He made a curse against Musa alayhi salam. But obviously when you make a curse against someone who's not worthy or mustahik of a curse, what happens? The curse comes back and hits you. So that's what happened. He made a curse against Musa alayhi salam and the Banu Israel, but the curse came back and hit him instead. So he was basically he's lost all his mustajab da'wat status now. So obviously he's not a close servant of Allah anymore. Allah would not accept his du'as and supplications anymore, and now he was like kind of destroyed in a way. So when he now returned back from the hill, he then said to his people that, look, there is one way you can destroy still Musa alayhi salam's people. And they asked him that, which way is that? So he then said that what you do is that, you know, the young girls from our tribe, tell them to roam around the Banu Israel camp, because they were about to attack Banu Canaan. Tell the young girls to roam around their camp, and what would happen is that the soldiers, when looking at the beauty of these girls, would commit zina, adultery with them, and then what would happen? Allah's azab and wrath would come. So it's mentioned that they told the young girls to go and roam around the camps of the Banu Israel. There was stories of a particular commander from the Banu Israel army who committed zina with a particular woman, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's anger and wrath descended on those people, and it's mentioned that 70,000 of the Banu Israel were destroyed. So that's what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was referring to, that what led to the Banu Israel being destroyed is through women. And when you look at it, this is something which men are always succumb to, is women. It's whenever they see a woman, you know, even though they don't even know her, just looking at her, they fall in love with her, and they start, you know, doing all these weird things and, you know, wrong things and haram things and so on. You know, and sometimes what happens in these kind of relationships, it takes us away from the straight path. It takes us away from the remembrance of Allah, because you look at a woman and you say, for example, are tempted by this woman, or you fall in love with this woman, you're praying salah, you're not thinking of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're thinking about this girl. You know, even when you are doing your religious activities, you're not thinking about Allah, you're thinking about this particular woman. Even when you go to sleep, you're thinking about this particular woman. So what I'm trying to say is that it's a very, very great fitna. Women, you know, lust desires, unlawful women, looking at them, gazing at them and so on. And nowadays with all these modern technologies like televisions, you know, internet, you know, and so on and so forth, it's very, very easy and tempting for boys, for young men who are not married, to be in contact with a girl. It's very easy. Even if you go onto a Hotmail to check your email address, even on the side they are like, what do you call it, advertisements, or do you want to meet a single girl, or do you want to meet a girl, do you want to meet a woman, and so on. So even if you're on Google just searching, even like an Islamic site, there's like, even on an Islamic site, Islamic website, you know, there's even advertisements, do you want to meet Muslim women or something like that. So the fitna, the zina is just all over. So we have to be very, very, you know, patient. We have to be steadfast, and the best way to remain steadfast is by, you know, getting married, because we then save ourselves from many, many sins and from many, many trials and tribulations. Now let's have a look at the section of nikah and marriage from a fiqh point of view. Now, one of the main conditions of nikah and marriage, there's two main conditions for a nikah to be valid. Number one is there has to be offer and acceptance. Okay, so there has to be offer and acceptance, ijab and qabul. And the second condition is there has to be witnesses. So the first condition for nikah to be valid is offer and acceptance. And the second condition is witnesses. And let's have a look at them in a bit more detail. Offer and acceptance. Now, offer and acceptance means like either one party will offer and the other party accepts. And what normally happens, or you could say what traditionally happens, is that the girl's family, the girl's father, say if the nikah is taking place in a masjid, so the girl's family, they offer. So the Imam Sahib who's leading the prayer, who's doing the nikah, conducting the nikah, he asks the girl's father, do you offer your daughter, let's say Aisha, you know, to Abdurrahman? So after the girl's father gives his blessings or consent, then the Imam Sahib would ask the groom, the brother like Abdurrahman, do you accept Aisha in your nikah in exchange for this much amount of dowry and mahar? And then when Abdurrahman or the groom accepts, the nikah is done. So normally traditionally the offer comes from the girl's side and then the acceptance from the boy's side. But it could also be the other way around as well. It could be like the man, the Imam Sahib could also do it from the boy's side. You could actually ask the man first, like Abdurrahman, do you want to, or do you offer to get married to Aisha in exchange for this much amount of mahar and dowry? So if Abdurrahman accepts, then the Imam Sahib could then ask the girl's father, or if the girl is there, could then ask the girl that, do you want to accept, or do you accept Abdurrahman's proposal? If the girl's father or the girl agrees, then the nikah would be done. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is that there has to be offer and acceptance for the nikah to be done. Another important condition for offered acceptance is that it has to be done verbally. Okay, the offered acceptance, it has to be done verbally. In particular, when the two parties are there, when the boy or the girl, or when the boy's side or the girl's side, when they are there in the same majlis or gathering, there has to be offer and acceptance, and it has to be done verbally. What is not allowed is, say for example, the boys here, the girls here, the Imam Sahib, he doesn't offer, or he doesn't let the boys say, I have accepted the nikah, or he doesn't let the girl say, I've offered to get married. But what does he do? He gets like a paper and he says to the girl, oh, you just sign here. And he just says to the boy, you just sign here. And that's it. And he just tells him, okay, you now married, and like go and give me £50, whatever, for the marriage or something. That would be wrong. Yeah, they have to do it verbally. The offer has to be done verbally from the boy's side, and the offer has to be, acceptance from the girl's side, or vice versa. That has to be done verbally. Just merely signing the marriage certificate, that's not going to be valid. What you should do is that you should actually do the verbally, and then afterwards get the marriage certificate signed. So just keep that ruling in mind. That's number 2. The second ruling is that if the boy or girl say, like if they said it, like if they, at that time when they said it, there was no force, then that marriage is valid. If later on they're complaining of force, or I was forced to get married, then we're not going to say, we won't say we're not going to believe them, but what I'm trying to say is that it will not affect the validity of the nikah. Sometimes what happens, you get this, you probably hear this a lot, like the man and woman, they get married, and then afterwards the man says, oh well, I was forced to marry her, or the girl says, no, I was forced to marry him. If at that time when the Imam Sahib asked the girl, do you want to get married, and she said yes, yeah, there wasn't any apparent force. It wasn't like somebody put a gun, next to her niqab or her headscarf and said like, I'll shoot you. And so, as long as there was no gun there or something, and the Imam Sahib asked the girl accepted, and similarly on the boy's side, there wasn't any kind of force, there wasn't a gun there pointed at the boy's head, and he willingly accepted, the nikah's done. If afterwards they say, oh well, I was forced and so on, then it's not going to affect the validity of the nikah. Just keep that in mind. Remember, forced marriages is not allowed. We'll probably touch on it later. It's not allowed in Islam. However, if they do say the offer and acceptance, the nikah and the marriage would be done. Okay, so just keep that in mind, because as soon as they say verbally, then the nikah and the marriage would be done. So that was the first condition regarding nikah and marriage, that it has to be done verbally, the offer and acceptance. The second condition with regards to nikah and marriage to be valid and accepted is that there has to be witnesses. Okay, there have to be gawas. There have to be witnesses. Now, there either has to be 2 male witnesses, come se come, the minimum, 2 male witnesses, or 1 man or 2 women. Okay, normally when the nikah takes place, say in a masjid, then you have a lot of people there, or if it takes place in a hall, then there are a lot of people there, so that's okay. But sometimes when nikah are taken privately, then the condition or the requirement for that nikah or that particular marriage to be done is there has to be 2 male witnesses, or number 2, 1 man or 2 women. Okay, these witnesses have to be there. If they are not there, the nikah will not be done. And another added condition is that these witnesses, they have to be Muslims as well. So if it's like non-Muslim witnesses, then the nikah will not be done. So from this we can derive, like sometimes if a marriage is taking place at a registry office, so if there's just like no witnesses there, just the man and the woman, then the nikah would not be done. Or if there are people there, but they are non-Muslim witnesses, then the nikah Islamically would not be done. So there have to be witnesses, and the witnesses also have to be Muslims as well. Another ruling here with regards to witnesses is that, remember, the witnesses and the two people, i.e. the groom and the bride or the bride's family, they all have to be present in the same majlis or in the same gathering where the nikah is taking place. So just say, for example, you've got the groom here, the bride, and the two witnesses, they all have to be there. If any of these components are missing, then the nikah will not be done. And what I'm trying to imply from here is this masla about marriage over the phone. So just say, for example, if the groom's here in Birmingham and he's got his witnesses there, and just say he's marrying a girl who's living in London, and they just like over the phone, they say the offer and acceptance, the nikah would not be done. Why? Because the girl is not physically present. Even though they may have the laptops, you know, the videos or whatever, or camera and so on, and they could see each other, video link, whatever, webcam, whatever it's called. So even then, even though you could see her in London, even then the nikah would not be done. They have to be physically there. So the witnesses, they have to be physically there. The groom or the girl or the girl's representative, they have to physically be there. The only exception is, we look at, I'll just mention it very quickly. The only exception is that if the girl made the groom or the boy her wakil or her representative, then only in that situation, the girl in the girl's absence, the groom can actually conduct the nikah. So I'll give you an example. Just say if the girl wrote a letter to the boy who she's marrying that I want you to conduct my nikah, you're my wakil, and I want you to conduct my nikah, then in that situation the nikah can be done. Okay, but if no wakalat or no kind of like, if the girl didn't appoint anyone as an agent or a wakil to conduct a nikah, then in that situation, when the girl is absent from that gathering or majlis, the marriage would not be valid, would not be done. So what I'm trying to say is that the witnesses have to be present, the boy or the boy's representative have to be there, and also the girl or the girl's representative have to be there for the nikah and the marriage to be valid and for it to be correct Islamically. Inshallah, we'll leave it there for this week. Any questions or?